Well, it is 9 a.m. Central Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, and all the other things. So, welcome everyone to another Reltio community show and Happy New Year. It's our first show of the year. Really excited. Today we have special guest, Michelle Popovits. Michelle is the first time, her first time doing this, and I've been trying to get her to do one of these for a while, but and here she is. So, welcome, Michelle. So,
Thank you, Chris.
you're welcome. So the rules of the show haven't changed. It's the same slide. Keep yourself on mute. Ask all questions in the chat, and or take yourself off mute. The show is going to be recorded and posted to the Reltio community. We do have a lot of content today, so questions probably will not be answered until the end, and or if we have too many questions, we will do a kind of a ask me anything around this, which I have a feeling there might be some opportunity to do that. So stay tuned on that. Upcoming shows is, of course, today's show. And then on the 25th, we do have a 2024.1 release. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do. We do have some coming February and March, just haven't been scheduled, just in the works as of now. And in the meantime, if you like podcasts, go and listen to some really good podcasts that have already came out this year and last year. It's on datadrivenpodcast.com. I'll push that into the notes here shortly. And then if you'd like to go to Gartner Peer Insights, please rate and review us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Michelle, and give the reins over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I brought a few of my friends along. They're in the chat. So if you do have some questions, I think some of them will be willing to answer as the show goes along. So just keep that in mind. Let me share my screen.
Perfect.
Screen 1, screen 2. All right.
There it is.
All right. I'm gonna make a few adjustments here. All righty. Okay. So I last year built some RDM utilities. Like many of us, we're on projects, we're doing some work, and we realized we need to do certain pieces of functionality, and it's not always easy to do that. And I found that to be the case with RDM. So first thing I wanted to do, my demo is in the sequence of the order I needed these things, so as I built them. So the first thing, and I'll just do a quick overview here, and then I'll go into more detail after this, was in RDM to basically clone a whole source of entries from one source type to another. A lot of times you want to duplicate that, and I'll show you what that looks like when I get there. And also you may have some sources by default in your RDM environment that you just don't plan to use. They're there by default, you want to get rid of them, and you can get rid of them very quickly with the utility I created. The next thing is the ability to make backups of your RDMs, or take a whole bunch of RDMs and promote them between environments. The current tools allow you, APIs give you a limited functionality in that you can only post 100 at a time or get 1,000 at a time. And when you have more of them, then you have more work to do. So that's 2 and 3. And then the last one is the RDM data loader. So a configurable way to take CSV data and for RDM and load it up and configure it in a number of ways. And I'll show you more about this as I go along. So that's what I'll be demoing today. Demo time. All right. So let me get out of the slideshow. Oh, I'm going forward. All right, so let's get down to the preliminaries.
I love that, Michelle. You just get right to the point. Perfect.
Yeah.
This is great.
So all this stuff is on Bitbucket now, and it's available for you to download. This will be available later. So I can always just stick this in the chat. in case anyone wants to click on it sooner. So you would download this zip file and import that into your environment. We have documentation here, and I've saved it in PDF form. It's really good documentation, but if I do say so myself. So you'd want to download and import that recipe package. You want to read the documentation. I'm not going to go into details about how to import because there's documentation that shows you how to do that. But let me go here. So if you're in an RDM, you would create a folder. You'd call it, I called it RDM. You'd go to RDM Lifecycle Management. You go to import, you do a plus here, select the folder that you created and import the zip file, and you just go through that process. And then you would go to properties, and there would be a RDM tenant ID property. You would want to set your tenant ID there. There will also be a second one that's optional to use later if you plan to generate lookup types that you want to promote to other environments, and you can just put that there, the one you want to promote to. Okay, recipes. Let's look at the recipes. Let's look at the structure of this folder. So the structure is, I have set up a subfolder in the project called common, and there will be some common function recipes that are called from other recipes. So you'd want to come in here and just turn all these on using the start. It's started now, but there'd be a start recipe here. So you'd start that up. And you'd go to each one of these folders here. You can ignore miss because that's just something I'm working on. You guys don't have that yet. So this is a folder for the clone recipe. I split it out one folder for each type of functionality so that underneath I can create what I call sample calls. And then there's a bunch of recipes under there that are just exactly what it says, sample calls. They were my unit testing as I was developing this. I unit tested different pieces of functionality, and I've just left that there. I figured if it was useful for me, other people might find it useful. So you would start this recipe, that's a clone. Same with the data loader. You'd start up the RDM data loader. There's some extra stuff here that we may or may not talk about today. Same with the get functionality. You'd start up get and get multiple. And then post, oh, it's not start up. You would just go here and you click start. And same with remove. Now, the first time you import this, you may not be able to start them right away. Let me go back up to the clone, open up clone, and you'll want to do this with each of your recipes. They will initially be in stop state. You'll want to connect your connections. So you'll click here. It'll already be in error state because it's not connected the first time you start this. So you'll just select your sandbox or your whatever RDM, your MDM tenant ID that you have. And some of them have an S3 bucket connection in there, so you'll set those as well. And you will just go through all those recipes and make sure they're all set up and everything's connected. If you are new to RH and you haven't set up an S3 connection or a Reltio MDM connection, that's a separate process you'll need to go through before you can use these. All right, so let's back up. Clone, lookup type source. What is that? I'm gonna go find my RDM in my sandbox. My favorite sample one is called test RDM lookup 1. I'm gonna open that up. And this particular lookup type has 3 sources, one called Reltio, who is also the canonical one as evidenced by this blue thing, a test 1 and a test 2. Now you'll see that 8 is different than 8C and 8C. So I have different types of data here. I want to add test 3 here. but there's no, if I do this, there's no data in that, and I can't get data from the UI. So I want to take the Reltio here, and I want to put it here. So let me just hide that column. And since there's no straightforward way to do that, except with my recipe. So let's go find my recipe. There we go, clone lookup type. So I'll go to my sample calls. Oh, before I get into the sample calls, what I recommend doing is not modifying recipes in here for your environment. Create your own project, like, you know, your company RDM. And as you find sample calls that you find interesting, just duplicate them. So here we go, sample call this. I would just go here and I would clone this recipe. And then I would just grab this and, you know, drag it to, you know, whatever other place I want to put it. And then I would work with it in my own folder. So that's what I do when I get on projects. And that way, whenever I want to take a newer version of the RDM utilities package, you know, you're not going to be overwriting anything, or right, and you know what's yours, your modifications versus what, you know, came with the package. So okay, so let's clone. Let me just back up one step before we get to clone. Let me look at, I'm not going to go through the recipe itself, but you will see that it's a function type recipe, which means it accepts parameters, lookup type, source to copy from, source to copy to, and a couple other parameters that I'll explain. So these recipes you don't touch. The idea is you're going to call these as functions, and you're going to pass in what you want it to do. And that's what my sample calls are for. So my sample call itself is a function, but I'm not passing anything into it because I don't need to. What I do is I have a step here that calls that function, and that's where I'm passing in what I need. So I'm going to click edit recipe. I'm going to click on this function call. And that's the best way to get started with this is to, you know, take the closest sample to what you want to do and then modify it. And that way there's a lot of things that are kind of set up. It's easy. You just look at it and say, oh, okay, I know what this should be just from the data that's there by default. So my recipe function, clone lookup type source. I'm working with this test RDM lookup 1. I want to copy it from Reltio, and I want to basically send it to test 3. Now test 3 as a source is already set up in my RDM environment. So that's fine. And I have a couple of other parameters here. One called read-only mode. If you're just doing this for the first time and you don't really want to actually change your RDM yet, you can just flick this to yes, and it will write the JSON to a lookup table, which I'll show you in a little bit. And the second one is basically, you know, truncating that table, that lookup table. If you want to start fresh, because it builds up with, you know, with entries over time. This functionality automatically creates a backup to that table, so you can have your JSON as it was, you know, before you changed it. So you can always save those, and we'll show that to you in a bit. So let's try this. We're going to take lookup type 1. We're going to create lookup test 3 from Reltio. So these I execute just in test mode. If you try to start this, it'll just start up as a function and sit there and wait for you. So we just do test recipes here. Test recipe, give it a go. Can't call the stop. I stop that recipe. So when you see that, you know, you didn't start your recipe up. So let's start this up. And go back here, back to our sample call. Let's use this one right here. Okay, so now that recipe started. I accidentally started this one when I didn't mean to. Let's get back in there. All right, so we're back here. Now let's try this again. Click test recipe. Test recipe. Wait for a few seconds. And it's successful. So let's go back over to our RDM tab. Click refresh. And here we are. Test 3 is here. So it's copied from the Reltio source like I asked it to. I could have had it copy from either of these. And there they all are. 8T8 matches 8T8. So you can just keep adding as many sources, duplicate them as you like. And the remove source is simply the opposite. I decided I want to get rid of test 2. Well, let me go back. And I will go down to remove lookup type source. I'll go to the sample calls that I already have set up. And it's very similar, except lookup type and a source I want to remove. So this time I'm removing test 2. So I'm going to keep test 3. I decided I didn't want test 2. So let's click test recipe. And that was successful. Let's go over to here, click refresh, and test 2 should disappear. And there you see test 2 is gone. We added test 3, we got rid of test 2. All right, let's go back and look at those lookup tables I was telling you about. Over here on the left, lookup tables. Just type RDM to filter. If you get errors, errors can show up in this table if you want more detail. We haven't encountered any errors. I have over time during development. I don't think I've ever truncated it, so I got a nice collection there. Anyway, util RDM JSON backup. There's only 2 entries here because I've set the parameters to truncate it every time I run it. But what I've done here is I should have, the first entry should be a backup. This first entry here, when I scroll down, this is a backup type. Get lookup before change. So this here is a JSON. You could go and take this out, put it into Postman if it were less than 100 and execute it. Or if it was more than 100, you could use my utilities and you could execute it against your RDM tenant. So it is runnable JSON payload for the RDM lookups API. So this gives you what it was before we did the remove. And this here is the JSON after we executed the process. That other parameter that said run in read-only mode, you could run it in read-only mode, generate only the JSON, and maybe execute it yourself. That's a possibility. I don't do that, but I felt like when I was making, changes in the RDM environment through a utility, I wanted to have some sort of backup to automatically get created. So you can run this, you can copy and paste this, you can save it off to a file, you have yourself a backup. You could run it once and read only, look at the JSON it's created, decide, yeah, I like that. And then you could also flip it to not being read only and then run it again. Whatever you're comfortable with. see, anything else? Okay, I think that's the clone and remove source functionality. Any thoughts on that before I move on to the RDM data loader? I don't have
Yeah.
too much time, but
Yeah, no, there's one quick question. How is it handled if it has more than 1,000 entries?
if it has more than 1,000 entries, it will loop. It'll process like 1,000 at a time.
Okay. Is the
I think there,
RDM go ahead, sorry.
I think there is an upper limit that the APIs can handle, and this will, I think it's like 50,000 RDM lookups you can have, something like that. Go ahead, Chris.
And you might not know this, but is the RDM environment needing additional charges?
Oh, to run these?
Yeah.
It's based on task usage, and the clone and remove and the get and post are not heavy users of tasks, so they're
Okay.
not likely to impact you. The RDM data loader is task heavy, and so you may want to monitor that.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to the next one, which would be, I'm going to do the RDM data loader next, and then I'll come back and do these guys. All right. Circling back a little bit before I get there is documentation. As I showed you, there's documentation in here. And each set of functionality, like clone and remove, this has its own set of documentation. And let me go up to the table of contents. Usually if you have a good table of contents, everything else should work out. So each document has some high level information about, basic recipe setup, some discussion about, the backup and error logging tables I was chatting about, and like some basic functionality, and some additional notes that I make at the bottom, where sometimes I repurpose recipes for other ideas. So that's the clone one. So I'm going to close that up. We're going to move on to the RDM data loader. So here's my very basic test for RDM data loader. I want to take this set of data and I want to load it into my RDM lookup type, the same lookup type that I've been using as the example. I have two sets of unique data, T1, 1, T2, 2, and now my second set of data is 1 and 1Z, 2 and 2Z. These are all part of the same lookup type. Just this is unique data that'll apply to one or more sources, and this is other unique data that'll apply to other sources. Hiding these floating meeting controls so I can see my tabs. And there's many different kind of formats. If I'm adding in, if I want to do start and end dates, I would add an extra couple of columns for the start and end date. If I'm doing localization, I can add, sets of columns for a localization. And I've done a number of different variations in my unit tests. And you can combine these in any way you like. The main key is there are always two sets going on an even odd scheme. So column A and B is column set, and I would call this 1 because they're a set. Column C and D, that's a second set. So I call that column set 2. And that would be column set 3 and then column set 4. So that's the terminology for column sets. In this case, it's code and value. This is locale and locale value, or start date and end date. Depends on the type of data you're wanting to load. So let's go over to the RDM data loader documentation. So this section of the documentation talks about that. How column A and B is column set 1, column set 2, column set 3, column set 4. And we can have different types of data in there. And I go on to, chat about this in the documentation. And then I need to, when I go to load this, I need to tell it what kind of data I'm loading in the configuration so that it loads things to the right place in the lookup type. So we will see in the configuration fields and the input called source, column set type, and possible values are source, which is when you'll use them most, codes and values. Parent, if you're doing references to other lookup types, that would be your column set type. If you're doing attributes, that would be your column set type. And you saw the start, end date, and the localization. So this describes what those are and additional information that you can read about. In the documentation, here's that sample we were looking at in the Google Sheet. I throw in a few screenshots to give you some visuals. You're not using the spreadsheets as they are. You're simply, this is a way you can set up a test. You would then save this as a CSV file. The data is consumed in CSV, not in a spreadsheet format. So there's a bunch of, and ultimately when we're using that in the recipe, it'll look like this. You can just copy and paste it in. And I'll show you that shortly. See if there's anything down here. Yeah, there's some more information, but I'm going to go into looking at the recipe because looking at too much documentation at once can not be as much fun. All right, so let's go over here. Let's go to RDM data loader. So this is the recipe that's doing all the work, RDM data loader. It's already active, it's running. So let me go find my sample call for my favorite little I've got, before I do that, let me just show you. I have a whole bunch of samples here and it goes on to a second page. These were when I was doing my unit testing as I was developing these functionalities. So you can look at, and I try to name them in a useful way so you can look for samples that closely resemble what you want to try out. And that way you're not starting from the ground up. Always copy the closest thing that you want to do into your own project folder and try it out. All right, so we're calling the RDM data loader. And the configuration for this is a little more complex than for the others. That's why it's especially important to copy until you know. We're loading this up to RDM lookup type 1. So let's go to my RDM. This thing here, it's got data in it. Let me clear that data out. I've got Postman on my other window. Let me just click truncate. And make sure that it's gone. All right, so I have an empty test RDM lookup 1. So let's get back here and find my recipe. So I'm going to load to lookup type 1. Let me collapse these guys. So I want to have three lookup like sources in there as we had in my little screenshot. There we go. So I want, actually, I just deleted it. So I had 3 there, if you recall. So I want those 3 back. So I've defined 3 items here. My source data only has 2 sets of data. And that's the beauty. If you're wanting to duplicate the same set of data to multiple sources, you don't need to copy and paste that in your CSV data. You can just tell it, just grab it from column set 1 and put it in all these places that we want. So what I'm doing here for item 1, I am saying column set type of source. Remember, we looked at that in the documentation. That's basically your code and values, which is, I think, all we're doing in this example. And the first one I want to do is the source for Reltio. So code and values, source for Reltio. And then I'm going to do column set config. And I can have multiple entries here, and there's some more advanced things you can look into later, and probably won't be demoed today, but there's examples in there. But the basic example is column set position 1. This column set position 1 says grab the data from those first 2 columns, that column set. So T1, 1. So that's what that's all about. Is it canonical? And so yes, only one of them should be canonical. That's why that one has a little whatever blue triangle to the side. That's our, defines that as our canonical value. And I've got some handy dandy little help text here. Is canonical use code? This will be confusing. If you, for some reason, want your canonical code to use the value instead of the code, then you would, or the code instead of the value, this is where you're changing that. Like I said, it's a bit confusing. Do I want my canonical code to show up as T1, or do I want to show up as 1? So you have that option here. By default, I say no in this particular one. So yes, use code for the canonical value, otherwise use a value for the canonical value. So this should use a value, I think, canonical value. Downstream default value, don't worry about this unless you're doing multiple values per source. So you could just set this, keep this always yes until you know you need it otherwise. So this is how we set up the Reltio source. So that's item 1. And then item 2. Again, we're setting up another source. This one is for test 2. And we're telling it to go after column set position 2. That tells it where it goes from. So it's grabbing the data from here. It's not canonical because there can be only one, so no. And then this doesn't really matter. And I always set that to yes. So that's the second one. So now we looked at 2, and then here's a third one, another source, and this one, now it's test 1. So basically we're rebuilding what I had from my first demo. In this case, I'm grabbing it again from column set position 2. So you're gonna have 2 sources that are actually having the exact same data without having to duplicate that in the spreadsheet. And this one also has a read-only mode, like the other functionality. If you don't want to write that to your environment, you can just set this to yes, and then you can go and grab it from your backup table. And in this part, you just paste in your raw CSV. I've pasted in lookup types that are that are greater than 1,000, or was it 10? Yeah, you can put quite a lot of data in these little text boxes. I haven't reached a limit yet. As an alternative, if you have some truly large ones and you need to load it up from an S3 bucket, there are recipes I've written that pull from an S3 bucket. I'm not demoing those today, but in most cases, just go this route unless you need to go a different route. What I often do is I'll actually create one recipe and I'll just keep duplicating this step, and then I'll just configure each one, duplicate it, configure the next one, and then just run them together, and then comment them out and add a new one. And then I just have them there and I can rerun them, skipping them and running them selectively. All right, so back here, we've set up our 3 column sets. We have our input data. Remember, you would have generated it as a CSV, or you would have had it in a spreadsheet and did save as CSV and copy and paste your data here. All right, so let's run this. And so that ran. Let's go to the RDM tab and I click refresh. And here they all are. So that's a basic use of the RDM data loader. As I mentioned before, there are many samples from my unit testing. In here. I've tried additional things like reading the data from an S3 bucket, putting the configuration in a CSV and an S3 bucket. Those are functionalities I haven't worked with a lot beyond developing them and unit testing them. So if you have a requirement for that, you can work with that. And just referring back to the documentation, where were we? The whole column sets that we were looking at in the recipe, the lookup type, your column set array, your read-only mode, your raw CSV, and I put the column set array in a separate table to make it easier to understand. As you recall, there's these different column set types. We've just been doing source there. If you want to do parent references, attributes, start end dates, localization, you would specify that value. And you can look at some of the samples to see how they've been set up. And then there's cases for multiple values. That's what this column set config array is. If you want a lookup type to have multiple values. The current multiple values is not as friendly as I'd like. Has multiple values. I have multiple values split over multiple column sets. So I'm looking at doing a different approach where I put them all in one column and have them delimited. That's just an idea instead of having to put them across multiple columns. That's just an idea I have right now that I want to implement, which brings me back to this RDM package, utilities package, isn't just, I built it and it's done and, that's the end of it. I will be happy to, when I have time, add in some changes, take ideas, from you folks. And you folks can learn from each other. I think I've added a little, let me go up to my documentation. Where is it? All right. All right, feedback and support. I'll take a quick chat with this before I move on. These utilities are provided as is without product support. You're free to use and modify it as you wish. Don't open a support ticket for issues that you encounter because it's not a supported product at this point. This is just something we're providing for you guys to use. There is a Reltio Integration Hub community site, which is separate from the main community site. This would be a great place for you to go to provide your feedback, your questions, and as you come up with modifications and enhancements to this, you can post those ideas there to share with us, other customers and partners. And over time, as I have time, I'll integrate some of those ideas into the package. I'm always looking to make things better. So yeah, so definitely help each other and support each other. And that way you're not going to be waiting on me to, have some time to incorporate those things. So that was the RDM data loader. Still doing relatively good for time. Let's look at the get and post. The API for the lookup types allows you to post up to 100 entries at a time, which is very limiting. And it allows you to get up to 1,000 at a time. So if I want to back up something that has, 5,000 lookup types, I've got to manipulate the API to say, okay, give me 1,000 in this set, offset, 0. Run it, save it, change the parameter, and just keep running it until you've gotten all 5,000 saved in separate files. And then you can't necessarily post that because you can only post 100 at a time using the API directly. So then you got to go back and say, no, scratch that. I know I can get 1,000, but really only give me 100, and then I can create a whole bunch of 100 files, and then I can go into Postman and post, and hope I don't miss any. What you can do here is use the get utility to get all of the lookup types for a single lookup type in one go. And you've got that backed up into a file. And if you want to promote that, you can just find replace the tenant ID and then take it over to another environment and post that. As I was using that on a project, I felt like that was too much work when I had multiple lookup types I wanted to promote. So often what I do is I build something, I use it, and I realize I'm still working too hard. I need this program to do more for me. So then I developed get multiple recipe so that I could get lookup types, data for multiple lookup types, and then promote that to another environment. So if I've got like 15 I want to promote, I just tell them, go get all 15 of those, pop it in a file, and then I go to the target environment and I post them there. And then I had to tell it which ones I wanted to get. So then I would use a lookup table. So I created a lookup table called util RDM get lookup type config. So then I would create a lookup table and I put the lookup name in and whether I wanted it included in the export. If it's Y, I include it. If it's no, I don't. So right now they're mostly N except for state, test child, test attribute, and my favorite, test RDM lookup 1. Of course, initially I was entering these items by hand, and I got tired of that quickly. So then I thought, this is again something my recipe should be doing for me. I shouldn't have to work so hard. So I wrote a little recipe to populate this with all the lookup types or any missing lookup types, and then you can just flip the switch, the ones you want to include. So let's take a look at the get and post functionality. Again, we got documentation here. It talks about these recipes and some of the helper recipes for the list configuration. Let's go back here. And for this one, I have another property that I use for the get multiple. RDM tenant ID to promote to. And so this is an RDM tenant ID for a different RDM, so that when I get multiple, I can tell it, put a different tenant ID in there, so I don't have to do that, search and replace manually. The main recipe doesn't use this itself, but my sample call recipe uses this. So that was just a handy convenience. So let's take a look. Get lookup type. So get lookup type JSON. That's the main one that will get each lookup type. And then there's RDM get multiple lookup type JSON. It actually calls this recipe in a loop. So one recipe is calling the other. So for just get me a backup of a single lookup type, I have this one, get JSON for lookup type as my sample call. And I'll just say RDM lookup type 1. If you want to save it to an S3 bucket, you can. This one just saves it to a backup table, the backup table. And so if I just run this like this, you'll see that this data shows up in my lookup table. Then here it is, full JSON backup for this lookup type, test RDM lookup 1. So if you wanted to take this and save it off to a file somewhere, you can. It's all the entries for that lookup type. In this case, it's not a very big lookup type, but if you had 1,000 or 2,000, they would be here. But if you start getting really big lookup types, it might be best just to choose the option to write it to a file in an S3 bucket. The get multiple, which is the one I tend to use more these days. Let me just go up here one. I have these 2 helper recipes, add missing lookup types. So you can just, to the lookup table configuration, if you have new lookup types and you don't want to add them manually, you can just come in here and run this. Just directly go and edit. There's no sample call recipe, just click test recipe. Do you want to default the new ones to be included or not included? And you can do that. And then that would add any new ones to that lookup table. And sometimes I wanted to change them all to yes or change them all to no. So I just created another one that says that will just take all of them and flip them to yes or flip them to no for export value. So, because when I was selecting them by hand, I felt that was too much work. I wrote a recipe to do it for me. So let's look at the get multiple. The get multiple writes to an S3 bucket. If you use something other than S3, you can modify this recipe and put whatever type of bucket that you use in there. Okay, sample calls. So if I go to, where is it? Get JSON for multiple lookup types to promote to S3. So let's take a look at this a bit closer. So I'm telling it the S3 file path name. Oops. So I'm telling it yes to write to the S3 bucket. I'm still logging to the backup table in this example, but if I have an awful lot of data, I would probably flip that to no, just so I don't have to write so much to the lookup table. And here, this is that other property that I was showing you earlier in the properties for RDM tenant ID to promote to. Because if I'm wanting to promote a whole bunch of, if I'm going to back up a whole bunch of lookup types in one go, I'm going to be using it to promote to another environment. So let's just tell it the tenant ID that we want the generated JSON to be. You could hard code a value here if you don't want to use a property. If you leave this blank or null, it won't change it to anything. It'll keep it the same tenant ID as exists. So if you just want to use it as a backup. And the neat thing about this is no matter how many lookup types you have and how many items you have, it all goes into a single file. So in my case, I think I had 4 of them. Where was it? Look up. Oh, not that one. So I had 4, state, test child, test attribute, and test RDM lookup. So when I do this get multiple, it's going to put all of these into a single file. So they're not going to be multiple files. The lookup API can do that, can process that when it goes to post it. All right, here we are. So let's give this a run. Let me show you my S3 bucket. Here's my S3 bucket. RDM data loader. Let me delete the one that's there. So here we go. RDM data loader path, nothing in there. RDM data loader path, export selected lookup types for promotion. And then I just click select and I test. And I generate that. Successful. Do a refresh here. And here it is. It's got 140 kilobytes. I download that. I download that. I've got them all here. The tenant ID, this is the tenant ID that I provided, C7, that's a different tenant ID that I've been using. There's test RDM lookup. There's probably test child is down here somewhere. There's test child. So they're all in here. And let's say I want to go and promote this to my other sandbox tenant. So let's just, I got another window here. There we go. Here's my other. This is my other. Let's reload. My second sandbox. Let's refresh. When you switch RH environments, you have to refresh a couple times. I'll refresh this. And you can see here at the bottom, test attribute, test child, test RDM lookup. These all have 0 items in it. So I'm going to go here because I have RDM set up in this environment. I mean, technically you could do this all from the same environment, right to another environment, but I like to only make changes to the environment I'm in, except in certain situations. So let's do post. This is the last one we haven't run yet. Post lookup type JSON. Whether you're posting a single lookup type from the get recipe or a whole bunch of them from the get multiple, it's the same recipe. Sample calls. And I created one here that comes from the S3 bucket, multiple lookup types. And because there's multiple lookup types in the file, potentially, you don't tell it what the lookup type is. It's in the JSON. So you just tell it the file, export selected lookups for promotion. And then I click test recipe. It's got a bit more data. It's a few extra seconds. And they were 0 before. I refresh. Hopefully the numbers change. And there we go. 9, 2, and 9. So the data that was in that file that I exported from the other environment got added to this one. Okay, I'm going to go back to my first environment so I can chat about a few other things. I want to go back to the data loader. One thing we hadn't talked about, data loader. I'm going to look at, all right. Oh, I need to refresh. Maybe you switch between environments, you have to refresh. Okay. RDM, data loader. Data loader. Right. Trying to get the list of jobs up so I can show you the tasks. There we go.
Beauty of demos.
Yeah, I came back. All right. So this is the one I ran at 7:35 PST. On the right here, you can see that it used 220 tasks. And that's for loading a handful of data. Now, if you look at my documentation, where is it? Task usage. There is a section on task usage right here. And this is more for the RDM data loader. It's important to note that this recipe can tend to use a lot of tasks if you're task conscious. And I had done an example at one point where I loaded something that had 1,000 entries from 3 sources, and it used over 22,000 tasks. And loading 5 entries for 3 sources, similar to what I just did, used only 210 tasks. So that's a good thing to be aware of when you're doing a lot of lookup types. And because of that, I recommend, and also for other reasons, pick one environment where you're using the RDM data loader, get things loaded up the way you want. And when you want to move to other environments, don't use the data loader in those environments. Just use the get multiple or get by itself and promote them using those other utilities, because they will be a lot more efficient. If I go back to recipe, RDM, get multiple. I'm running out of time. This is get multiple. How many? It downloaded a bunch more. It used only 13 tasks to bring it down. And when I did my post, how many did I post? Let me see if I can get this refreshed so I can see how much the post took. Post. Post took less tasks. It used 6 tasks. So the get and the post are a lot more task efficient. So use those and use only the data loader where you need them. Let's see, where are we? We did the demo. You guys know where the Bitbucket is. I threw that in the chat, and also this will be available on the community site. Recommendations: import the package into your tenant and give it a try. Read the documentation. It's pretty good, if I do say so myself. Learn more about RH by reading the recipes and playing around with them. We haven't looked at the recipes at all today, but you can make copies, you can play, you know, it's all fun. It's not like it's hidden in some Java bytecode or anything. It's RH recipes. So go play with them. And as I mentioned earlier, get notified of updates to this and other RH packages, as well as provide feedback to us and help each other. Go to the RH community.
Well, Michelle, wow. This was really amazing and lots of great content, an amazing turnout. So we didn't get to all the questions, but what I did do was post the questions on the Reltio Integration Hub community and tagged Michelle in all of them. So
I'll be busy for a while.
Yeah, there's 4 or 5 of them. And
Oh,
we'll get an
not too
answer.
bad.
Yeah, we'll get an answer for everyone. Please give us your feedback after this. When you leave, you'll get a Zoom kind of, feedback kind of thing. Take it. It's only 3 questions. It's a really a gift. So thank you everyone for coming, and Michelle and team, thank you for answering the questions and for everything. And Happy New Year, everyone. We'll do this again in late January, and we'll do it throughout the year. So thanks for coming. We hope you liked it. It's probably one of the best turnouts we've ever had.
Awesome.
This was awesome.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.